Today on The State of Us, the political wildcards of 2022. Things don't look good for the Democrats, but with so many things up in the air, any predictions are risky. Well, welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only, the friendly redneck liberal, and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. Today, we're looking at a piece from the Wall Street Journal. It actually came out a couple months ago, but it still has 6 great points that we'd like to look at, some things to consider for the political deck in 2022, what's going to affect both Republicans and Democrats. A lot of people have assumed that it's a foregone conclusion that the Democrats will get walloped in November. And while Lance and I definitely wouldn't be prepared to say that we disagree with that, we do want to look at a number of the things that we think are going to be determining factors. And if nothing else, hopefully highlight why it'd be too soon for anybody to make a solid prediction, because there's a lot yet still to come that could have an impact. But before we dive in, Lance, do we have a word of the day?
We have a word of the day, but I think it's a discussion point more than it is the word of the day. The title of the article is Political Wildcards of 2022, right? So I looked up wildcard in the dictionary. So what is a wildcard? It has 2 definitions. It is 2 words, W-I-L-D, so it doesn't really fit the definition of word of the day. And then there's a space and then C-A-R-D. And it doesn't even tell us if it's a noun or a verb or anything here. So it's kind of a interesting situation. But of the 2 definitions, one is card games, a card that has been declared wild. Okay, didn't know that you could define a word with a word, but second.
But they did.
They did in the dictionary. Sports, any of the teams other than those that finish in first and sometimes second place that qualify for a championship playoff. So here we have a word or words in a title, the political wildcards of 2022, and yet neither of these definitions, I guess we would go with the first one. In a card game, a card that has been declared wild. Like these are things that, I know how we use these words in this connotation. I know what the connotation is.
Right. But interesting that from a definition standpoint, it's kind of obscure that I think it's sports/games brought it to prevalence, because when we look at the historical usage, it was pretty much non-existent until maybe about 1970. And then it's just skyrocketed in use since then. Oxford Dictionary says that it is a playing card that can have any value, suit, color, or other property in a game at the discretion of the player holding it. So I guess maybe the way for us to think about it would be, an asset that could be used at the discretion of the individual that has possession of it.
Again, not technically like we usually use a word of the day, but I found it interesting that the definition of wild card really doesn't fit politics. We can pull it out there, to use it, and we all know what we're talking about, but it's not defined as such.
The second definition, and Oxford Dictionary calls it a noun, is a person or thing whose influence is unpredictable or whose qualities are uncertain.
So we've added to the definition from 1980 dictionary to the Oxford Dictionary online today.
Yes, which would make sense given what we see about the historical usage.
The trend of it, exactly.
That word was not hardly used at all when your dictionary was printed. So what are the wild cards? Well, we're going to look at a number of them because there's a lot to take into account. First and foremost, we've done an episode on this recently, so it shouldn't be a surprise, but inflation has emerged for the first time in decades as a big factor in voters' calculation of how the economy is doing. And Lance, I know why this is on here. I understand why. But boy, is it frustrating, because calculation of how the economy is doing. So what does that have to do with the election. I'm confused.
Oh, you mean,
are we voting on the economy? Is that what we vote on? Do we go vote for the economy? Yes or no economy?
yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we do. We vote,
Gotcha.
we vote with our pocketbooks.
We just put people's names there and we all convince ourselves that they have a lot of say over.
And there are people that
how
are
the
writing
economy
now
works.
and arguing this point that, oh no, cultural issues are really the most important things to people. Well, I think there are some people, some voters out there that's true. You know, they honestly, wholeheartedly believe in something so strongly because of their moral conviction or religious conviction that takes precedent when they get ready to vote. But I still believe that the majority of us vote with our pocketbook. And that is, if we're doing well, then we want the people who are in power to stay in power. If we're not doing well, it's not my fault. So I'm going to blame the people that are in power, and I'm going to vote in new people who are going to fix the problem so that I can start doing better. So when you talk about inflation, which the government really, sorry people, they really don't have a whole lot to do with it. They try to fix a few things and do all that, but we live in a market economy, okay? It's driven by things outside the control of government. But historically, what happens is when things go haywire, that's when we turn to the government and say, do something about it. If things are going well, then we're chanting, stay out of my life. Things are going well. I don't want the government involved. But then as soon as things get tough, then we turn to the government and say, hey, you got to fix this.
Sounds a lot like, whiny teenagers, right? I want my independence. Leave me alone. I know what I'm doing. And then the minute that things head south, Mommy, Daddy, I need your help. Help me.
The car needs to be fixed. It needs a new set of tires. I don't have any money for the rent. Help me. But, it's always easier, right? And it's that same, that analogy when you point your finger at somebody and says it's their problem, it's their fault. You got 4 fingers pointing back at you.
Yep.
So, now, does that mean the government can't do some things, to try to alleviate some of the pain? And true, that's true. But then you look at that same government and say, stay out of my life. I don't want you to tell me whether or not I can own this item. I don't want you to tell me where I have to send my kids to school. I don't want you to tell me what my children are going to learn at that school. Oh, but wait a minute. I want you to fix gas prices. I want you to make sure the shopping shelves are full at the store.
Yes, sure. I mean, well, everybody does, right? I mean, we all want the best of all worlds if we could have it. It's the reality of understanding that generally that doesn't work. And also that typically speaking, the president and Congress don't have as much control day to day over the economy as I think we all like to think. It doesn't mean they don't do things that affect the economy. That's not what we're contending. I'm not sure how many people recall this, but the Fed, who arguably has the Federal Reserve, who arguably has the greatest control of any of the branches of government or any of the, bureaucracies of government over the economy, they don't report to the president or to Congress. They are, technically speaking, independent of those entities. And they don't, like the president cannot order the Fed chair to do anything. Historically speaking, the Fed has never successfully tamed inflation at this rate without causing recession. Mm-hmm. They have never successfully done that. Doesn't mean they can't pull it off. It's just an important item that this doesn't really get into because it focuses more on inflation. But the point is, well, what is inflation causing? Well, inflation is causing the Fed to take the actions it sees as necessary to try to tame inflation. They've made it clear by whatever means necessary, because even causing a temporary recession in their mind is better than allowing inflation to run away. The last time that it got this high, the Fed got incredibly aggressive and brought interest rates, like close to 20% for a short term. And that, of course, caused a recession. But inflation then was tamped down and came under almost down to 2%. So they can get it under control. The big difference here is that, when they've done this in the past and they've done it successfully, they were out in front of it. And now they're reacting to it. And that's never a great position to be in. But I think sharing that's important, Lance, because it's that thing that people don't understand about who has control over inflation? Well, it's not really the president and it's not really Congress. It's pretty much the Fed, and even they have a limited control over inflation. If they do one thing, the economy may suffer in another direction.
As the statement reads, inflation has emerged for the first time in decades. Okay. Inflation is a piece of a capitalist market economy. So the doomsayers out there, we've recovered. Is it going to take some belt tightening, and is it going to cause people to some consternation and to live a little tougher for a few months, years? Yes. Will we come out of it? Yes, we always have. So I think it's just the fact that it's been so long. Everybody thought, oh, well, I was always going to be able to buy stuff at 0% interest.
The next thing is one that we've talked about a lot on this show, but not directly, as I think it relates to politics, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The question posed, would voters rally around President Biden in his response or deem his actions insufficient? I still think this one's a substantial wild card because obviously, as people listening know, this conflict's not over. Now, have things shifted in the past few weeks? Sure. But it's not done yet, and there's still a lot of different ways this could end, which could lead to a varying host of potential responses from President Biden. And you might, hopefully, some of you are sitting there thinking, well, who the heck cares, if President Biden's not up for election this year, right? So it doesn't really matter. Well, that goes back to another thing that Lance and I feel like have talked about for some time, right? And we'll continue this into the next segment is voters don't really, we've continued to give the president power. We've continued to devalue the other branches, arms, and procedures of government. So is this really an election for Congress, or is it an opportunity to vote on whether or not we like President Biden's leadership? Find out. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How's that going to affect the 2022 political landscape, Lance? Well, we talked a little bit about a way that it could, because people blame the president and they vote based on whether or not they're happy with the president.
Well, it just gives those people who didn't want President Biden in the first place to argue against his foreign policy as a whole. You have the removal of troops in Afghanistan and how that was messy. And now here you have this incident. And as we've talked about, you have North Korea looking into nuclear weapons and making advances. You have Iran. And so it's like, oh, look at all this that's going on President Biden's watch. Well, these are historically things we've dealt with for the last 20, 30, or in the case of North Korea, the last 70 years. So to your point of giving too much credit or too much blame to the president, these are ongoing situations that each president has to pick up and decide what direction to move on with policies that have been in place for a long, long time. So the whole issue of Ukraine will probably be going on in some form or fashion to presidents' hints, because what's going to happen with NATO? Where's the line going to be drawn? Are we going to step in? To your point of being a wild card, where's it going to go this summer? Where's it going to be this fall? Does it all get wrapped up and Putin goes back to Russia and Biden looks like a hero and Ukraine becomes members of NATO and all the things that look like, well, no way that could happen right now. Okay, right. Or does the war expand and Russia sends some nuclear weapons in, even the fallout goes into Poland, which is a NATO country, and now what's the response? And we're in a full-fledged war over there. Again, I don't know what's going to happen, and neither does President Biden, but Biden's going to get the credit or the blame for whatever takes place there.
Sure. Well, and unlike inflation, obviously, the president does have a much more direct ability to affect foreign policy and to dictate the direction of our military than he does the direction of inflation or the direction of.
But again, it is
recession.
up to Congress to declare war. And I know this is a sticky and leads into the whole Supreme Court issue, the whole War Powers Act and after Vietnam. Can the president put troops in anywhere they want for 30 days and then have to get a declaration of war or move them? Well, that's not constitutional. The president has control over the military and can do whatever they want. Well, but it also says in the Constitution that only Congress can declare war. So we've never really had an issue where we have to get into play this. But, there are constitutional scholars who say the War Powers Act is constitutional, and there are scholars who say, no, it's unconstitutional. So yes, the president does have more power over this than inflation. But just how much constitutional power do they have, particularly if people are looking for reasons to not want to support the Democrats?
Well, and obviously the ongoing complications of how we've muddied the waters over the years by, well, it's not a war, right? I mean, we call it like the Afghanistan or Iraq war, or the Vietnam War. But generally speaking, some of these things, we use the word war, but there's a distinct difference between World War II, where Congress did declare war, versus Afghanistan and Iraq, where that is not what happened. And, from an official U.S. sort of policy standpoint, those aren't wars. And in fact, folks, it's worth noting that historically speaking, Congress has not actually declared a war since 1942. So everything that we've been involved in since then, legally or congressionally speaking, was not a war, which goes back to what we've been doing for the past 70 plus years, 80 plus years, right, is this move toward making the presidency more and more powerful. And therefore, when you make somebody more powerful and give them more authority, you also get more blame, even if it's that whole thing, even if a staff member goes rogue, right, and does something without that person's consent, or you don't even have control to stop them from doing it. The more perceived power you have, the more blame you're also going to simultaneously receive when things go south. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying I think that is something to account for here, right? Especially with foreign policy, Ukraine, that kind of stuff. Biden, does Biden have the ability to stop Russia from dropping a nuke in Ukraine? Well, we've done a lot of episodes, and you should go listen to those. The Supreme Court, which Lance hinted at, is our next one there. They're doing a lot of different things right now, not the least of which, you mentioned those sticky social issues that people are highly convicted on, Lance. It is possible, given some of their forthcoming cases, that something big could happen on abortion. And I think that's, not that the other stuff on our list isn't big, but for example, if Roe v. Wade was overturned, it would be certainly impactful to the forthcoming midterms, I would imagine. So which way it would be impactful, there's that wild card component, Lance. I don't know. That's a hard, other than it would be a heated midterm cycle, I think.
It would show how divided our nation really is. I don't see this happening. I think we can see continued cutting away at things like we've seen over the last 20 years. But I can't fathom the Supreme Court totally overruling Roe v. Wade.
Certainly something to keep an eye on. But again, they're also considering a host of other issues. And often people don't pay a lot of attention to it until the court hears it, and sometimes until they've issued an opinion. And it'd be very interesting, to see as their current, term comes to a close, and then as their new term opens right before, the midterms, how that all is going to play into.
Typically late September, early October is when they start hearing cases. They take a summer recess, and which means they're studying all the cases that are going to come before them or picking the cases that they want to hear to come before them.
So that will definitely be an ongoing one. I mean, it'll kind of be on pause here as we go into summer, but then it'll come back with a vengeance, right? As we know, and as we've seen in some past, particularly presidential elections lately, there can be a lot of last minute stuff that has a big impact on how it all shakes out. So next up, Lance, and this is one we've also talked about, state legislatures and independent commissions across the country are busy drawing and redrawing congressional district maps based on the 2020 census, which can have a big impact on both parties. There's a lot of different stuff going on. There's legal challenges that ties into the Supreme Court. There's, the ongoing date changes for primaries. And like in the great state here of Ohio, because of the problems that we've been having getting a map, there are going to be 2 primaries this year, which will be interesting. So we'll have our regularly scheduled primary with all the candidates that aren't impacted by, the redrawing of maps, and then we will proceed with another primary once the maps are finalized. So that's just one example, but there's a lot of this going on across the country, and so important to understand, Lance, that how these maps are drawn literally impact the makeup of Congress.
Well, it goes back to why it's so important when the census comes to your house to fill it out. Or to make sure that somebody knocks on your door, that you get counted in all different ways, taxation and here in representation and the way the lines are going to be drawn. But here's what I'm thinking of as you're saying that, and I don't doubt anything that you say. Wow, how hard is it to get people to go out and vote in the midterm anyway? And now you're going to have 2 different midterm primaries. Now, that means going out to vote at a time when not very many people historically vote. Your vote's going to count for more in this primary if you are in a state like Ohio where the maps have been redrawn and everything's in an uproar, and most of your fellow voters will not go out and vote. You're going to have a big say in what happens here in the 2023 Congress, because fewer people voting means more power in that vote that you're placing. And especially when a lot of these elections are for the House of Representatives, which, Democrats hold a very slim margin right now anyway. Yeah, this could be very interesting. This is the thing that gets my blood going, because this is going to be fun. I mean, it's going to be a mess, but as far as a commentator and talking about it and a historian, this is I can't believe it. It's like, wow, this is going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, it'll be another one of the items that's tricky, because not only could it have the impact like in Ohio to potentially disenfranchise voters or confuse them badly about what's going on, which then leads to them not voting at all, but it also has to do with how gerrymandered will the final maps be and who will they favor? Because that, as much as I think we'd all prefer, hopefully, that the will of the people is the will of who is elected, in terms of we are equally represented. That's not how it works. That's not how our system is set up when it comes to Congress. So I think that's, worth noting, obviously. All right, we've got a couple more, Lance, to talk about. We're going to both look at Hispanic voters and how they're going to play into this, as well as perhaps one of the largest questions looming over the landscape is, will former President Donald Trump be a help or a hindrance to the midterm efforts? Sort of a similar question could be asked about current President Biden as well. So we've got a lot still to talk about. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Hispanic voters appear to be up for grabs this year. A Wall Street Journal poll taken late last year found that this group, which has long leaned Democratic, now is evenly divided between the two parties when asked its 2022 voting preference.
Yeah, I mean, this is big, and it's been a recurring theme for the last 20 years. It's interesting as, one side markets itself to one group or another, how the Hispanics that are here are tending to more and more go Republican to where we're now in a dead heat at the same time when we have this anti-immigration thing going on. But you say, yeah, that, I don't understand that. Well, but Hispanics typically are working and hardworking and look at the police as, law abiding. And so many of those things that the Republicans talk about ring loudly, as well as some of the social issues ring loudly with Hispanics, as maybe not as much as with other minorities. And so, this is interesting dynamics that's taken place. And, you start thinking of places like Texas and California, and you wonder the impact that it's going to have. Florida, where you have larger Hispanic voter bases, that this is going to be interesting to watch as we've watched it evolve over the last 20 years or so.
It is also, perhaps speaking to the overall political landscape, something that Lance and I have alluded to for a while, which is that the parties sometimes assume that certain policies or positions they take will appeal to people, but then they don't always seem to recall the things that apparently matter most to people, which, as we talked about earlier and hinted at, the economy is a big one, but not the economy in an abstract sense, the economy and how am I doing and who do I think is going to do the very best thing for that. Now, to Lance's point, there are people that will vote, because of their moral convictions first and foremost. So that group would be more exempt from this. But you have obviously Hispanic voters who are taking a real look and saying, I'm not sure that Democrats' policies in regards to the economy are really the best thing for the economy. And regardless of whether they're right or wrong, they're taking a look at that and saying, that arguably first and foremost, that's what I'm worried about. And we have to remember too that, generally speaking, we find that the immigrant population tends to have overall a stronger work ethic than your average American these days. And so they're going to be likely to favor systems that are based on how good can you do the job? Because if that is how the system is set, or if they believe that's how the system is set, if you're somebody who's in that position, if you're, kind of a Lance Jackson of the world and you're willing to do the grind and put in the work and beat out the competition, then you may want a system like that, and if you're more interested in not really having to work very hard or kind of taking it real easy, well, then you'd probably want a system that takes more care of you. So interesting how this dynamic is shifting, where I think the Democrats would like to be seen as the party of immigrants and of people of color. But as we increasingly are seeing, that's not necessarily holding hard and fast. And that, I think, Lance, is all the more reason that I've said Democrats continue to do a disservice to themselves by not building up rural coalitions. There was a time when Democrats could have been seen as the party for people in rural America who were on the down and out. And I think they've got a real image problem. I'm not saying the Republicans don't, but I think they've got a real image problem. They have built it on soft ground that I think part of what polls like this tell us, voters aren't necessarily sold on their platform.
Well, it's human instinct. I'll support you. And then if you start taking me for granted, well, then I might look for somebody else who's willing to talk my language, right? I think your point that you've made time and time again is that the Democrats have taken different groups of people for granted. And when you do that, you run the risk of losing them. And that's what's been happening over the last 20 to 30 years in national politics. And so the Democrats don't have, a strong hand over people of color and different minority groups. And that's made these elections so close and so tight in all of these different areas. And whether it's for the president or a Senate seat or for a seat in the House of Representatives, and so that's what happens. You cannot take any group of people, any one individual person for granted, because if they feel like you're taking me for granted, then I'll go somewhere else and support somebody else. And, but the elephant in the room, right, has got to be former President Donald Trump, right? As we look at 2022, because I know here, again, we mentioned locally, right, politics are local, but here in Ohio, I can't watch a show without somebody running for Senate who mentions the name Trump, either as a positive or a negative. I mean, it's in every political commercial that I've seen for the last 2 months. To the point that I'm sick and tired of it. I mean, I just change, if I'm streaming, I 15 seconds, boom, 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 I'm through. I don't want to even watch it because I know them all by heart. And it has something to do with former President Trump.
Yep. He is and continues to be a figure that elicits a lot of different feelings from people, positive and negative, but generally speaking, pretty strong feelings from most people. Have strong feelings one way or the other.
I don't talk to anybody who says, "Oh yeah, President Trump, I can take it or leave it," and that's not the way it goes. No,
you haven't run into a lot of those people.
I've never run into anybody like that.
Okay.
Nope.
So yeah, I think as a president who's obviously no longer in office, but only served one term, the important thing there, and that's part of what I think's kept him relevant. One is, he's definitely not known for being quiet. So there's that. He is insisted in staying relevant. But number two is the issue the party has, which is he going to run again? Because, unlike, right, say President Obama leaves office, he's not running again, right? He's not going to be president again. So there's a very different sort of aura around a person like that, because Obama's role is clear. There's only ever been one president who, after having been president, actually went to Congress or became a senator, and that was John Quincy Adams. And that was, 200 years ago. So
and William Howard Taft went to the Supreme Court.
Right. So, I mean, it has happened, but it's so rare and it's been so long ago that nobody's looking at Obama, right, when he leaves office as, oh yeah, it's really likely he's going to go serve in some important public office again. That nobody had that at the forefront of their minds of being worried that they might upset him, and then face his wrath, so to speak. It was, on the other hand, that's very different with Trump. He served one term. Obviously, the other thing is the nature of his defeat in the election. A lot of people, feeling like it was stolen. So you have a lot of animosity there too. A lot of people that still support him and what he wants. And he certainly, could run again. So I think that the possibility of him running again is a big wild card, which in effect creates a wild card in 2022 for people that are, do we want to upset him or not? Are we okay?
But he's out there picking candidates. Uh-huh. He's out there supporting certain people, right?
Or attacking people that or don't get his endorsement.
Exactly. And so, that will come down to, will people vote for his endorsed candidates, or will the Republicans choose people of their own choosing to run? So that's not even before you get to the general election in November as to whether or not they can defeat the Democratic candidate, which is interesting because we know historically, right? We've talked about it all the time, how in most presidential, midterms like this, seats are lost in the House, and the Democrats only hold like a 5-seat advantage or something in the House. So we would think historically that they're going to lose control of the House. And then people think, well, hey, you got a 50-50 Senate right now, and so that means they're going to lose the Senate. But as this article points out, the paradox here is that the Democrats might have a better chance of holding the Senate than they do the House, because of some of what we're just talking about. The Republicans have had some retirements, like in the state of Ohio, but also Pennsylvania and North Carolina, which are swing states in the presidential election. So that means they're probably going to be pretty close here in the senatorial races as well. So you have those Republican seats that are up for grabs now in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio. And also incumbents in Florida and Wisconsin, Republican incumbents are facing tough battles. The Democrats on the other side face the difficult challenge in holding seats in Nevada, New Hampshire, Arizona, and Georgia. So if you weren't counting, there's like 5 tough Republican races and 4 tough Democratic races. And when it's 50-50, so how is all that going to shake out? Wouldn't it be ironic that in the midterm, Democrats lose the majority in the House, but gain a majority in the Senate? That's why it's a wild card, folks. That's why you got to stay tuned, listen to the show and watch. But Justin, wow, what do you think there? Just quickly, that the Democrats could take control of the Senate without having Vice President Harris having to constantly break ties, and therefore also take Joe Manchin out of limelight a little bit. Might be easier for them to do that than it would be to hang on to the House.
A proposition that I think to many of us, if you'd asked us 2 years ago, would have been like, yeah, that would be much easier for them to take the House than the Senate. But given what's going on and the retirement of some of these key Republicans, 2022 is going to be definitely not a boring year for politics. There's a lot still up in the air. And as we know, the handful of swing voters, many of them won't be making their decision until the final 30 days. And in some cases up until the day before they go to vote. So, there is plenty of opportunity for any of these 6 or 7 things we've discussed to have a sizable impact on how people decide to vote, particularly those swing voters that, as we know, will tend to determine the most contentious of seats.
That make up 18 to 20% of all the polls that are being taken right now. 40% of the people are voting for the Democratic candidate in their area, in their state, and 40% are voting for the Republican. By God, they already know that. Doesn't even matter who the Democrat or the Republican is. They've already told the pollsters that's who they're voting for. So we're all going to sit back and wait for the 20% out there that are watching these wild cards to decide which way they will cast their ballot.
Yep. So it'll be a very interesting year. Of course, we'll stay on top of it because we have a mission here at True Chat, right, Lance?
We do. And our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had one today on politics, and it's getting my blood pumping. I love it. We've kind of taken a break from politics. Love talking politics. We all have feelings and emotions, and hopefully it gets the conversation started around your household and your workplace. And as you do, and you share what you hear here from us, tell people they ought to listen to the show, and tell them they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast. We're heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you, our audience, for tuning in. We will see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.